This video is going to be more specifically about the textures and materials. I'm not going to get into rendering just yet, but of course rendering and materials goes hand in hand. This will come full circle when we go to the rendering video, but we're going to start with just textures. And I'm just building off of the last file that I was showcasing, but we're going to go straight to the Textures tab. And here I'm going to click New, and this will allow us to add a new texture. You can experiment by adding any texture really to this, and I would encourage you to just try some stuff, especially if you have like source textures or kind of materials that you're interested in exploring anyway. I have a bunch that I've been collecting over the years. Some of the best ones, actually all of the very best ones that I have from the Substance Designer kind of suite, which is a texturing suite. You see it's actually been recently purchased by Adobe, so they've been moving stuff off of this launcher that I'm showing this from right now. But they have a lot of just insanely gorgeous pre-made materials, and I've been accumulating my own library of these things. But some other places you might look, of course, you can just Google textures or materials, and depending on what you're doing, they might just be perfect. I literally, for this, I just grabbed this texture. I don't know what it's going to do, but we'll see. I think it'll be cool. And I'm just going to click Open, and here's this file. You can see it's pretty subtle, and nothing has happened. It's just added this texture file to my Blender. I'm going to rename this texture, though, to the brush. I'll just name it the brush. And of course, I could use this texture file now to put a digital material on, not too dissimilar from what you've done previously with just using digital materials. But I'm going to actually go into sculpt mode, and I'm going to, on the default sculpt brush, you can do this with any of the sculpt brushes, but on the default sculpt brush, I'm just going to texture, and then if I click this little arrow, all of the textures I have will be on this list, and I can just pick one. So now I have loaded that texture into my sculpting brush, and I can sculpt it onto the model. You can see that, so I'm actually holding, I just discovered I think this image really needs to be inverted for best results, because at the moment, if I hold Control, it pulls the geometry out. What I could do, so the sculpting tool works by your distance from the object, or the scale of the brush relative to the object. So if I'm super close, it's going to be big, but if I'm super far, it will be big. If I'm super close, it will be less noticeable. So there I actually just I texturized this model pretty much instantaneously by just sculpting that texture onto it. It's a little bit messy, and even though the polygon count on this is already pretty high, I would probably want to subdivide it even farther if I was set on using this kind of method. Here's where the subdivision surface, the super dangerous and probably don't do this method, comes in. I'm actually just going to hide all of the previous versions on that by just turning them off. And on this one, I'm going to add a subdivision surface. This will take some time. There, I've added my subdivision surface, and it has definitely smoothed out the brush a bit, the brushwork a bit. If you up the levels in the viewport number, that's exactly what it'll do. You'll see I'm already over 1 million polygons. I'm almost at 2 million. If I up this again, it's going to go even higher. And it actually didn't really improve the results that much because the texture I was using didn't have a great resolution. But this will make for some really nice rendering. That's the one use of textures. Another use, I'll actually add a sphere. Another use of the textures then is specifically with a couple of the modifiers. I just added a default sphere. I'm going to go to edit mode, subdivide it twice. I'm going to add a subdivision surface. I'll go to 3 and apply that. And now I'm going to hit displace. Displacement is really powerful and really cool. it does require quite a bit of polygon count. So displacement has you load a texture in, and then based off of the object's texture map, the UV map, it will displace the geometry. It will give the geometry from the texture to the object. So I just select that brush texture, and you'll see it has made this terribly disgusting, gunky mess. But really all we need to do is turn down the strength. So it starts at 1. If we type 0.1, oh, there we go. It's already getting closer to what we might want. Just going to 0.0545. It's pretty good. You'll see here, though, where it's running into the limits on the polygon count. And what we can do, again, be careful with this because your scenes can bloat out really quickly. But if you're set on trying this method, I would at least try it once, maybe, just to see what you can get out of it. But I'm going to add a subdivision surface. So this will be our first example of stacking modifiers. And the order matters. So this is me subdividing after the displacement. But if I subdivide before the displacement, it now increases the fidelity of the displacement. So if I up that number, it gets closer and closer to that original texture. You'll see it's stretching it in the middle, and that's because this is based off of this object creation. It has decided that the texture map is from this top-down view. So from the top it looks amazing, but then if you look on the side, it's disgusting. What we can do though is we can go to the edit mode, and as you stack modifiers, this gets slower and slower, by the way. But I'm going to go to UV unwrap, and I can just tell it to do a sphere projection on the object. And this will change how the displacement is mapped onto the object. So here, rather than having it do local coordinates, I want it to be the UV coordinates. And now you'll see that the texture is applied as a really nice 3D geometry to the sphere based off of that sphere projection map, which is pretty sweet. This would already make for some pretty nice renders, honestly. But I digress. Let us continue on in our journey through materials. And this is where we'll begin with our new object. There's no material applied to this, which is actually pretty sweet. It gives us a blank canvas. But let's say we want it to just be blue. A simple blue. You don't want anything crazy. Just a simple blue. I just click a new, and I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. I'll say we'll call it simple blue. Simply blue. Like a really lame paint brand or something. And you'll see by default these materials have kind of ad nauseum options, which honestly you can just play around with these and you'll probably end up with something cool. But the simplest version of a material is the diffuse BSDF, really. And it just gives you a color and a roughness level. And if you want to include a normal map via texture, you can do that. But we're just going to put a blue. A nice sky blue. And if you want to see what that looks like just on the object, you can go to the shaded mode. And of course you can then play around with how blue, what kind of blue. This will be, I'll leave this as is for now, and we'll get into this more specifically with the rendering. But this is a very simple material. And if you want to get more in depth on the material, you can open up a shader editor. And I have this object selected, so its material is what is located here. If I swap this back to that principled BSDF, which was the default, you'll see that this list again is much longer. And much like Unreal, this is a node-based system. If I have a roughness texture, for example, I could drag and drop that in here and apply it. I just grabbed this one material from the website here, the pixels or whatever. But what we can do is we could actually use that exact same material and generate a normal map. So I just open Photoshop. I'm going to open up that image file I downloaded. You'll see here it is. It even has this awful cut line in it, but we're past that point of no return. We'll just roll with it. I just press Control J to duplicate that. Filter, 3D, generate normal map. And it takes a second for it to load in some of the tool sets, but you'll see exactly what it's giving you here is a little bit of control over some of the detail and the blur. You can play with these settings as much as you want, and here you have levels, controls, etc. If you have specific objectives for it, I encourage you to maybe play with it some more, but I actually want it to be just nice and crispy. So we'll take all the blur out and we'll give it some nice detail, and we'll click OK. So you'll notice that the 3D tools can be buggy sometimes in Photoshop, which just happens. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to quick export. I'll just put it straight in my downloads folder. I'm not going to be too picky about it right now. Please be cleaner than me. Please be, please. And voila. I have dragged my normal map in. So if I wanted to apply that normal map, I can pull it straight into there. And we'll go ahead and make this blue again. And you'll see it's given it some extra detail. It kind of fakes some additional lighting. And here's that really disgusting line. Oof. We'll just go with it though. We'll only capture it from this front. So we have a normal. What else we could do is, of course, if you have a specific roughness texture or something, you could do that. But we can decrease or increase the roughness, which is the shininess. If you decrease the roughness, it becomes very shiny. If you increase it, it becomes more matte. The last thing I'll show on this particular bit of the material stuff is how you could add a color gradient to something. In these nodes, how you pull up new options is you press Shift A, which brings up the search. And I'm going to type in the coordinates because I want a texture coordinate node. And again, this is very similar to Unreal. If you got deep into that at all, this will be fairly familiar. But this will give us a really cool ability to map the spatial data of the object into the texture. And where that becomes super interesting is if we add a color ramp. And a color ramp is a sweet material or a color node here that can give you a gradient. And I'll actually put the plus symbol to add another color, because what we can do is give it a transition from blue. Let's go from blue to, we'll go this way across the color wheel. So we'll go from blue to orange, and in the middle, we'll go to pink. So we'll have this sunset color gradient. And you can actually just plug this into the color now, and you'll see that it has only turned it pink. So what you have to do is you have to plug in some of this data into the factor tab. You can actually just try a few different ones of these. So if you go to generate it in, you'll see it has made this gradient just this direction across the object, which we could slide this bar around and you'll see exactly what it's doing with that color gradient. If you go the normal, now the color is going to be based off of the normal of the object, which can be pretty interesting. You can see it's giving it some shading in these crevices. The UV, which is going to be based off of that sphere map that we mapped onto it, which you can see that really disgusting seam line, so you would want to make sure you're capturing it from the other side. And object, which is more just a standard blend there. Out of all of those, I thought the generated was probably my favorite. But you can just play around with a couple other options here. Linear just linearly goes from color to color, but you can do stuff like ease, which will soften up those transitions. And of course, you can just change the colors on the gradient to be whatever you might want. So I would encourage you to experiment with this. You can have some really interesting results really quickly. Again, the simplest version would be to just have a diffuse BSDF, and I would encourage you to experiment with some of these different types. If you press Shift A, you can just find these different nodes just by looking down the list, and if you go to shader, it'll show you all of these presets. If you want to go and try some glass, for example, just know it takes a bit longer to render glass, but it looks really nice. Glossy is very similar to diffuse, but for glossier objects, and translucent and transparent can also be similar to the glass as well. But yeah, I would encourage you guys to just experiment a bit and have some fun with it. I suppose one other really interesting one to note is the emissive material, which is a material that emits light. So you could have this object as a light source, so it would have geometry and light emitting from it potentially for rendering. But this is where we'll end this video, and the next one we're actually going to go straight into the bash, and after that I'll show you stuff about rendering more specifically.